So let's talk about Iboga next. You've got an episode coming up about Iboga. There's a lot of really interesting research going on related to Iboga. What is it? Where does it come from? What do we know about it today?
So ibogaine is an alkaloid from a shrub that grows in central West Africa called Tabernanthe iboga. The shrub has a root that's rich in a number of different alkaloids, and the most abundant, most studied, most prominent one is ibogaine, although there are others. And although you hear a lot of discussion of the entourage effect in the psychedelic community or similar types of effects, I think that often these effects are not really evidence based. It's more of a sort of like materialist vitalism that people are imposing on the substance. But in the case of Iboga, there actually is a pretty strong case for the other alkaloids contributing. And the best piece of evidence for that is that ibogaine isn't even the strongest one. Ibogaline is actually a stronger compound than ibogaine. So anyway, it's a chemically fascinating series of alkaloids that this shrub produces. They're very structurally complex. They have a ring system that is synthetically challenging to produce, and a kind of three-dimensional structure that's really impressive. I mean, I don't even think you have to be a chemist to just look at the Wikipedia entry for ibogaine and take a look at that molecule and see that there's something really cool about it. And so these compounds, in addition to being chemically interesting, they have very complex pharmacologies at different types of acetylcholine receptors, NMDA receptors, serotonin transporter, and on and on and on. They also seem to release a number of neurotrophic factors. They have anti-addictive effects. They have psychedelic effects. They have borderline dissociative anesthetic effects. And they have also been centrally integrated into a religion called Bwiti.
And what is that? Can you talk about the religious context?
Yeah, it's a religion that is practiced primarily in Cameroon and Gabon.
So this is West
That
Africa.
Yeah, Central West Africa, and and probably to a lesser extent in the DRC, and it sees it's a syncretic Christian religion. So they see the Iboga shrub as the tree of knowledge of good and evil described in the Christian Bible.
Hmm.
And they worship Jesus among other things. And they have it's a very rich, very beautiful tradition. There's a wonderful, very rare book that was written about it by an anthropologist whose last name is Fernandez, it's called Bwiti, and you can probably find a PDF of it online. Highly recommended. He was kind enough to allow me to use a lot of his photographs in the piece,
Mhm.
and I just think that I've traveled to 30 plus 33 countries, studying psychoactive drugs, and I have seen a lot of religions that have a drug component to them. And I would say that Bwiti is the most beautiful, the most rich, the most sophisticated, the most awe-inspiring of them all. I have just tremendous respect for everything that they have created there. And it was one of the greatest experiences of my entire life to use Iboga with these Bwiti practitioners in Gabon and to observe how they helped people in their community.
How did that transpire? How did you get involved? How were you able to do that? Did they take you right in?
Yeah, they did, because they're proud of their, in the same way that people are often proud of their religions.
Yeah.
In the meth episode, all the Christian people that I was interviewing were extremely, extremely happy to talk about what they were doing. And believe it or not, they loved the episode. That the preacher from that Christian church, his only response to it was he wants a signed copy of a DVD. He loved it. I think that religion is really central to the lives of a lot of people, and they have a lot of internationally, people have a lot of pride in their religious practices, and it's a central point of community gathering. It's a point of spiritual transcendence. It's a point of support. And so they were happy to allow us to be a part of it. Their really only objection was that some of the people working on the camera crew weren't taking Iboga. But other than that, they were really happy with the whole thing and very, very helpful. And those interviews, I wish I could have cut this. I mean, one of the tragedies of making these things is that, each episode's only an hour long, a television hour. And there's so much amazing stuff that I would love to include. People say, why didn't you include this? Well, I would love to. I wish that one in particular, I wish could have been longer, because there were so many amazing things. The shamans that I was interviewing were so tired. I've interviewed countless people. I've never in my life interviewed people that did this. They were so tired that I would ask them a question, they would answer it, and then they would lose this. And then they would wake up for the next question, because no one is sleeping, no one is eating. They're dancing for 15 hours a day. I mean, it's a feat of incredible endurance. And I think that there's an implicit lesson contained within the ritual, which is one of self-reliance and a sense that you have what you need to survive. You don't need drugs. You don't need sleep. You don't need food. You don't need water. You don't need to pee. You don't need any of the things that you think you need. You have it all inside yourself. And that idea is transmitted to everyone inside the church and the people that are struggling with addiction, which is another thing. When I was making this, my idea was, most Iboga documentaries that got addiction follow a white person who is addicted to heroin, and they show how a white person is using this African shrub to treat their addiction, which is fine. Every people of all races should get to use to enjoy the medical benefits of this plant. But what I found ironic and somewhat unfortunate is that this is a plant with a history in Central West Africa that now has a serious problem with opioids that, unlike the United States, they've never had opioids before. So, we can talk all day about how no one knew oxycodone was addictive, and this is a popular talking point in discuss the so-called opioid epidemic. They'll pretend that no one knew opioids were addictive. I am pretty confident that people did know that opioids were addictive. As people will just keep repeating that all day, as if doctors didn't know there was a big curveball. Oh wow, oxycodone was addictive. Who could have predicted that? Whereas that is a valid argument. People have no culture. They haven't grown up watching depictions of heroin addiction on television and in movies. They have no culture of opioids at all. And then a extremely inexpensive synthetic opioid, tramadol, becomes widely available, and the results are potentially catastrophic. So what I wanted to do was show the use of Iboga as a treatment for opioid addiction in the same region where this plant actually has a history, because it struck me as ironic that everywhere else in the world, if you talk about Ibogaine, it's only known as the drug that is a treatment for heroin addiction. Yet in this part of Africa that it now is experiencing a surge in problematic use of tramadol, people are, for the most part, not using it for that purpose. It's still like a religious sacrament. So that's changing. And that was what I was trying to depict in this piece, was to show the changing environment where the traditional practices are transforming to incorporate the ultimately American, ultimately New York-based idea that Iboga or Ibogaine can be used as a treatment for opioid dependence.
Yeah, one of the things, I mean, I love this story. It's a beautiful story in terms of the religious context in which this drug is used by this culture. I had Brian Murarescu on my first episode of the podcast to talk about the immortality key, which you've probably heard about. And one of the things I learned, not only from that book, but just over the years as I grew up, was how weird modern American culture was in a certain way, which is that I think if you look historically, and I'm not an anthropologist, I don't know what the stats are, but a very large percentage of human cultures historically throughout human history have had a psychoactive or psychedelic drug that was an intimate part of their religious rituals, right? Whether it's ayahuasca use in the Amazon, whether it's peyote use in the Americas, whether it's this ibogaine ritual in West Africa, whether it's the things that are in Brian's book about the early pre-Christian use of what was probably an LSD-like compound and other things. It's actually exceptional that in America for the last, I don't know how many years, a lot of the major religions have basically divorced themselves from the use of a psychoactive. And that's actually bizarre. Like, what do you think that is? Is it just our puritanical history in America?
And there's a sort of schizophrenic component to this, because at the same time you have more people in the United States using psychedelics than probably any other country in history, any other time in history. Mm-hmm. So people are using enormous quantities of the substances, but it's decontextualized, and there isn't a framework that is supplied to interpret the experience. And depending on your perspective on that, it's not even necessarily a bad thing. But I think for religions, it is actually really unfortunate, because I think that arguably you can say that the psychedelic experience is a religious experience. Mm-hmm. And if that is the case, what religion wouldn't want to integrate these spiritual catalysts into their practices? I mean, when I attended these Iboga ceremonies with the Bwiti church, I just felt so connected to everyone. And I really felt that what they were doing was not only valid, that it was the most authentic, useful, powerful spiritual practice I had ever encountered anywhere in the world. I was a convert. Mm-hmm. and I think that a lot of people could benefit, because what we call, in the United States doesn't really have any meaningful connection to, I think, what the core components of what religion should be. I was bar mitzvahed, I learned Hebrew, I went to Israel to read my Torah portion. No aspect of that was in any way transcendent or religious or spiritual for me.
So in terms of your Ibogaine experience with the Bwiti people, what was that like? What did it actually feel like when you did it?
When I was making the piece, I was actually trying to de-emphasize my own experience. Often when I do these things, it ends up being about me. And one thing that I was trying to do in this most recent series was to direct things in a verite direction, and to try to direct them away from me and my own explanation, because I think people have a real appetite for sort of infotainment. They want people to explain everything to them. Mm-hmm. And I was kind of hoping that a lot of the experience could come via observation of other people, but there is, of course, something missing there. And really, I chose to emphasize the experience of a local Gabonese man who was suffering from addiction to tramadol, and to tell the story through his perspective and his transformation, because I am fortunate enough to not have any opioid problems. And I thought that if the point was to show this different perspective, to show somebody else who's suffering, who's a local person in Gabon, that would be the best way to tell the story. But part of the ritual is they did want everyone to use Ibogaine. The elderly, children, babies, camera crew, and myself.
Babies.
And yes, babies. Yeah.
Wow.
But they, they're intelligent about their dosing.
Yeah.
I'm not going to get into the safety of giving Iboga to an infant. I was talking with one of the people from the church yesterday, and who's been using it since they were probably an infant, and they're certainly sane and functional. They're a student. They're responsible. They have a great relationship with their family. So I think it's Well, I wouldn't want to make any claims about its absolute safety. I think that it's pretty clear based on that local tradition and that cultural context that it is possible to use it without extremely detrimental effects and with potentially, at least according to them, beneficial ones. So I did use it. In the past, I had only used purified ibogaine hydrochloride that had been produced via the Chris Jenks method that is depicted at the end of the episode, where boa cangine is extracted from Blaconga africana, and then a demethoxycarbonylation process is used to remove the methyl ester to produce ibogaine. So I had actually never, strictly speaking, used an Iboga derived alkaloid before, and the doses varied depending on what day of the ritual it was. So everyone used a small sort of stimulant dose, and that would be maybe comparable to, I don't know, maybe something like 75 milligrams of ibogaine hydrochloride. And then on the final night, everyone used a larger dose. And I would maybe compare that. It was more a more profound experience than I've ever had from ibogaine hydrochloride. But I've never used more than 50 milligrams of ibogaine hydrochloride. But I might loosely suggest that it was somewhere in the range of, similar to what I might imagine 150 milligrams might feel like. And I'm aware that people use much, much higher doses than that. There are people that use grams of ibogaine. So 150 milligrams is actually pretty low on the reported dosage scale. But for me, it was sufficient. It was powerful. It was profound. It had, you often hear people compare the psychedelic experience to psychotherapy, and they'll say, when I used LSD, it was like 10 years of psychotherapy in 10 hours. But it's kind of, it's an analogy. I wouldn't really say that it's actually like psychotherapy. Whereas I would say that ibogaine is actually like psychotherapy in that it has an almost verbal character where I would verbally work. It was like an extended conversation with myself that lasted the entire night, where I'd work through problems in this hyper logical way. And it was like,
you felt like your mental faculties were intact?
Oh, absolutely. I felt like I was more logical than I have ever been in my entire life. And it wasn't like a kind of, there can be a somewhat reductive and unrealistic character to the revelations that certain psychoactive drugs promote, like MDMA, where you might think, I love everyone, I forgive everyone, everyone is, good, or something like that. It wasn't like that. There wasn't this feeling of, oh, it's just, the answer is love, everything is love, or anything. Like, it was a very logical unpacking, and in some sense a very a sort of detached perspective on a lot of events in my life, where I felt like I could see them from some kind of pseudo objective perspective, where I would think like, oh, you think you hate this person, but you don't hate that person at all. You actually love that person. And the reason that you think you hate them is because it's easier to think that you hate them than it is to recognize that something complicated happened, and that it's more painful that it happened to someone that you actually like. And so you're pretending that you dislike them, but the whole reason you were ever involved with them in the first place is because you actually like them, and you're causing yourself more pain by pretending that you dislike them, where if you just acknowledge the reason that you were ever acquainted with them in the first place is because you like them, then it will make it less painful when you think about them. All this kind of like endless dissection of relationships in a way that felt like I was, just like unknotting a twisted string of bizarre delusions and justifications to straighten out my own mind. And it felt fantastic. By the end of it, I felt like the luckiest person in the world.
So it felt, you just put this image in my mind of a literal unknotting, like you're cramped up and everything's excessively complicated in terms of your rationale for different relationships. And there's a kind of release that comes from literally unknotting these convoluted stories you had told yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was very, I would say, very real, very actionable. There's a kind of a stereotype that people have when it comes to psychoactive drugs, that the revelations are delusions, and that in the hard light of day, when you look back on it, you'll realize it was just a drug induced delusion, and none of it had any meaning. This was so far from that. In some sense, it's very personal, and to go into all of it would be beyond the scope of this discussion, but it was very real. And to this day, I look back at it as like, I genuinely believe it was the most logical I have ever been in my life. And it was such a gift to be able to think about things the way that I was at that time. But in terms of the visual experience, it's not very visual. It does not, it produces closed eye visions. I was having kind of like maybe like Keith Haring-esque kind of like line drawing type imagery, but I was really just like in this extended dialogue with myself that lasted the entire night, that felt like it was all oriented toward working through problems and coming to a reinterpreted understanding of my relationships that was beneficial and persists to this day.
Wow. How do they administer it?
With a plastic spoon. It's
I,
the root of a tree. The tree is dried, the root is dried, the outer bark is scraped off, it's sifted, it's collected, it's kept in a crystal goblet, and the Iboga is dosed either with a plastic soup spoon, or the Bwitiist takes a pinch of the material between his thumb and forefinger and just puts it into people's mouths. It's not weighed on a scale, but they even say in my piece that there's a posology to everything, and that is true. They're looking at every person. They're giving a certain amount to children, a certain amount to the elderly, a certain amount to women, a certain amount to men, a certain amount to people that are using it to dance, a certain amount to people that are musicians. And they are really thinking about how to organize this immensely intricate ceremony that is like a performance. It's like so many things. It's a transcendent religious festival that is also almost like a dance party, that is also like a concert, that
the whole
is
village participates in it.
also like a hospital. Like it's really strange.
That sounds fascinating though. So is it swallowed, or do you absorb it? Do you let it sit in your mouth?
It's swallowed, and they give you water to wash it down.
Hmm.
And sometimes they give you other little things, like I think there's little like maybe a small amount of smoked tobacco or a small amount of whiskey or something would be consumed with it, but for the most part it's just swallowed and washed down with water.
Wow. So it's orally active. It's not like DMT in that way.
Yeah, it's certainly orally active.
Have you